Okay, today I want to talk about Silverlight 4 with RIA Services, and today we finally get to talk about RIA Services. Last time it was all set up and it took a while because we were starting from ground up. We had to talk about XAML and Silverlight and a lot of the things for context to understand how RIA Services fits in. But the main thing here today is I'm going to talk about the concept and show you kind of how the code looks once we get it up and running. So, for a high-level overview, I don't have many slides today. And the reason why is, again, most of this was done before for context. So I want you to think about a couple of things. The first issue to worry about here is that we're going to build a navigation app. We could also build the business app that has some service hooks in there, but you're going to have to set up authentication and everything else. So I want you to imagine what you're seeing on the screen is when we're doing this and we create the app, the navigation app creates the web part and the Silverlight part. So it's building two projects in a solution. And the one that I'm showing here, I'm going to have a different name for the project I'll show you in code. But I'm going to be building, and I started building today, a RIA test app until my services tanked with the Visual Studio problem. And then it builds a corresponding test app.web unless you do something about it. Now the first part you want to do when you want to do a RIA service is remember you're doing this on the server side. So you want to create a RIA service and there's a number of steps. If you want to think about this, when you create a service is pretty much like what you would do with the entity framework. It's really exposing most of the things in the entity framework and it's building a proxy for you so Silverlight can address those methods directly. So if you want to do link to entities kind of approach, if you want to sit there and use other different programming styles, anything that really is available on the ASP.NET side, which is traditionally on the server side, you're going to have available on the Silverlight side. It's just building a proxy. And it's using code generators to help yourself out. So to do this, the process is we create an empty database. I was going to show you today using the SQL Server Compact 4 database because that's an easy way to do it. And it's very quick once you set up a local approach that works with, let's say, SQL Server Compact database to convert this over into, let's say, a full SQL Server system instead of SQL Compact. SQL Compact 4 does anything that SQL does pretty much, except for stored procedures. It does everything within thread. So if you think about this, what you're going to do is if you have this database in SQL Compact instead of a traditional SQL Server database, SQL Server is going to run its own thread, do its own things. Okay, this is going to be an in-process kind of thing, and it uses data files. It has record locking, everything you're used to, but it stays in process. So the server process thread is what you would use within the SQL Compact database. Okay, not a big deal, but it turns out that thread overhead then isn't there. So for smaller websites where you don't need huge amounts of record locking and a large database where you're going to go over like the 4 megabyte or 4 gigabyte size, Compact can be a very nice alternative. And if you want to, you can scale databases by having more copies because there is no licensing issues that you have to deal with. Okay, but once we create our database, or we can have it auto-generated. If we create a database, put it in your app data folder within web. That's the thing that they'll always tend to nag you on, that you want to put this in app data by convention. Then the next part, once you've done this, is you're going to create an entity model. And this is Entity Framework 4. And the way I've been doing it is pretty much model first. And I could show you a little bit of the steps for model first. I just can't build it into a real service right now because those steps for the service connections right now I have are broken. But the app that I've done it on previously is up and running. So what you do is you can create a database, then we can create an entity model, and there's different approaches. You can actually take, if you want to do database first, you can create a database model with your association tables and everything else, and have it generate a conceptual model. The entity model is a conceptual model, and it has an EDMX extension when it builds it. The way I'm traditionally doing it is I create an empty model, and you can build the schema on the fly very, very easily. You don't do anything with an association table, you just do an association. The conceptual model then will generate an association table for you. And that's something that's more recent. Earlier versions, Entity Framework 2, really didn't have some of the richness of doing the models you really cared about, so you had to hack it and tweak it. Right now, as you're getting kind of a core set of model properties where you really can use this as a full-fledged object relational mapper. Okay, so you basically create the entity model, and you can right-click on the model and use it to generate your database. And it will basically give you the SQL commands for the database, and it will generate all the connection strings and service connections that you need to be able to connect up Silverlight with your service. In terms of the database hooks. Once you've done this, though, the model doesn't work until it's compiled. Until you compile it, there's not going to be much there, so you really have to compile it. So you've created your entity model, and you set up your schema and just kind of draw it up the way you want to. And you can use it then to generate your database from the model. And then the final step is you can create a RIA service. And this is basically a domain data service. It's under the web subsection. We create a web domain data service, and traditionally you're going to have some conventions. So for example, if you have something with a database, maybe name the database the same as your model, just pre or post pin model at the very end of your name of your data store. Okay, do the same thing with your service. Okay, that way you can associate very much your service to your model. Okay, so at the very end, what you're doing is the test service, when you create it, you basically will look and see what kind of models you have for your entity framework. And I'll point here the right way. Once we've created a service now, this is going to be a proxy that goes to Silverlight. So what's happening is you must, as rules, have your data entity and your service entity in the same DLL. There are ways to kind of separate it, but they're all lame. So right now is when you have a database model and you're doing things with the entity framework and you're going to do things with these RIA services, you're going to have to stick them in the same DLL. You can't separate them and say, well, I'm going to do ASP kind of things with just the data model, and then I'm going to use the RIA services with a separate DLL and decouple them. They're joined at the hip. And what you're doing then is you're proxying these through, and they are very tightly coupled. In the future, I think enough people are whining that may be a change, because really you'd like to have separation of concerns. So I want you to imagine, right now is if we're going to do this, I'm going to show you an app, and I'm going to show you the web corresponding part. But in real life, you probably want to have the service with the web part and the Silverlight part. And then you'd put those as dependencies. But realize you can't separate the database from the service. That comes through. So on these steps so far, in terms of this high-level overview, we've set things up, and then on the web side, we're setting up our database, setting up our conceptual model. The conceptual model then generates the database. Our conceptual model then also is used to generate your test service. And then we have to do our next step. And the next step is we're going to have to proxy this over. Well, what we do when we build this, and you can do this automatically when you get started, is our RIA test app, our Silverlight piece then, is then automatically, if it's associated with the web piece as a RIA service, it'll look for any services that are generated on the web part and automatically generate a proxy over on the other side so you can access the service by Silverlight. Okay, what this means is you create a database, you better go compile the model, and then you got to go build the database and do all the parts. Then once you've done this, you create your service. If you try and create your service too early, you won't see the database connections in there, and you just select what database piece you want. Then you need to recompile it again, and as long as your Silverlight app is connecting as a RIA service to your ASP side, your server side, then you're going to automatically build proxy code in your compile step. After you've done this compile step, then you can start using it in your Silverlight app. And it's going to be automatically seen as a data source. So if you have data-bound controls, you can just drop these in and automatically you're connected to the database, which is wonderful. And it can be very fast, assuming the whole path works. So what I'd like to do is just kind of show you an example of this application that I have running right now in Visual Studio. What we have to get started, as you'll notice on the right side, I have two projects and they're collapsed. I have SL RIA for Silverlight RIA 1, and then I have a corresponding SL RIA 1.web. Okay, top one is the client, bottom one is the server-side code. You will also notice that I have under here my slria.web. One of the things I want to talk about is if you use the default web server for Visual Studio, it's called Cassini. It's the internal one in Visual Studio, and if you can build a quick page and you can go see it. If you do that, it won't work with services and you'll immediately die and nothing will work. So one of the things you can do under this on the server side is you can set things up under the web tab here, and you can use a local IIS web server. What I have configured here is just a single web server. I'm using IIS Express. I'm using the new one that came out about a month ago or so. It's 7.5. Nice part about this is you don't have to have administrative privilege to be able to run this. So you can test out services without the full privileges of a full web server, and then configuring IIS to do the same thing. It'll coexist with IIS proper. So if you get the IIS Express and then some of the tools that comes with it, they have some really nice things from a development standpoint. So if you want to do rich service development, this is a wonderful way to get started, and then you can worry about configuration and customization on a full IIS server once you get the basic core functionality up and running. So literally, if you set things up so you're using then the Visual Studio server, the Visual Studio server then won't work with these services. So immediately do something else. You're going to need a full IIS server or IIS Express, and I really recommend trying to use that for this kind of development. Okay, that's the first part here. Now another set of properties to look on, we're going to change from the web project over to the Silverlight client project. Go look at the properties again. And what we care about here is under the top level Silverlight page near the bottom, you'll notice that there is a WCF RIA Services link. That's by default going to be on Silverlight now in newer projects. So all you have to do is select, if you have 3 or 4 things with services, you're going to select any of the server-side DLLs that would have services you care about, and you select one. Now that sounds bad. You can only get one service as opposed to multiple services. But realize you can have multiple DLLs, each supporting a different service. So you're going to build your server-side project, or you're going to build your client-side project, but you can link them up so each client talks to an appropriate service. And now you've got a good way to encapsulate different functionality based on its usage. So if you're going to have administrative tasks, you can have an administrative service. And then if you have client tasks, that could be yet another service. If you have maintenance tasks, these different roles can all be partitioned into a corresponding web piece and a Silverlight client service, and then you just link in on Silverlight, your main app, these services you want to reference, and so you can access as many services as you want. Good way to partition it. Only problem is, again, the database and the service are coupled tightly at the hip. So this is the main thing here, is we can always attach the service, and without this connection, this is the thing that Visual Studio uses in the builds. When you compile it, it says, I've got a service and I have a client. I'm going to generate automatically the proxy code for the client when I get going. Okay, on to the web service then. Just to show you something really quick, is under the model tab. Model and service are just directories that I made. Okay, you're going to assume your database models and all of your model code are just going to go in the model tab. Whoop, right? What I did was I generated a new entity model, and it's one of the data tabs that you can go through. And when you get there, the top level EDMX file is a conceptual model. If you want to build a new entity, for example, all you really have to do here is you can just right click and say add entity, and you can automatically add a new entity. I'm going to do this and then pull it back off when I'm done. So we can give this a name, stuff. Really good name, huh? Now, nice part is we can do associations. If you want to, you can actually have an association between classes. And an association traditionally would build yourself an association table. You know, that would match between, let's say, my books. Instead of stuff, I could have this being authors. I can match books and authors. We do a book-author association. So most things you want to do, literally you're just sitting there in a design surface, and you're not worried about the conceptual database details of how you're building up the tables and such. You're building a conceptual programmatic model. This is an object think kind of form. This is model first programming. Then when you're all done, all you really have to do is there's a generate database from model. And it will go build your SQL code. Right now that piece is kind of broken because I got this service problem, but when it does, you can build SQL compact databases, SQL server databases, whatever you need to, and they can auto-generate in the fly. Alternatively, you'll notice you can update model from a database. So if you're a database wonk that wants to build the databases with the association tables, you want a conceptual model for it. You know, that's that database-centric, model-centric mismatch. What's happening is there's a model here that does this mapping for you. And it's done with a number of XML files that defines these entities that we can conceptually deal with. Okay, so this is the way that we build our model. So you can just select your entities, select your properties, and when you're all done, you just right-click, and it's going to create just a generic set of boilerplate code to do everything you want. Okay, I'm going to undo this. Hopefully I can undo this far enough. Okay. And then we go and build this type of form. Now the next part for the service is you would go add a new domain service. And that's under a web tab. I don't have that right now, but I want you to imagine the steps here. You would then compile this form to make sure that your entities are up to date. And after you've compiled it, make sure you compile it, then you go build a new service, and one of the things it'll do is it'll look for all the entities that are there, or anything that has a tag that indicates as an entity. So if you have a data structure with like a key tag or attribute on it for an ID, that's enough to mark it as an entity. So when it's doing a scan or reflection on your project, that's enough for it to look and say, hey, we can make a service on this. But any entity framework entity is automatically going to be put there, and there are other ways to make this. You can separate the database model even further if you want to. And right now what I'm showing is pretty much straight to the metal. The entity you're building is exactly your service. It's coupled to the database. So programming ASP.NET and programming on the RIA service really is giving you the same identical functionality. Okay, but you don't have to have that if you want to expose a different service from your database entities. Okay, so from this conceptual model, it builds a number of things, and then SQL, you know, this is just standard SQL you can use to go generate a new database. Okay, that gives you your table structure and everything else you need. And if I had this done right, it would just pop up, you know, into Management Studio and just pop in a new database, and you're ready to rumble. Okay, nothing else. That's really nice. Okay, so if you don't have to customize this, it works very well. The next part, though, is that when we go on to the Silverlight client side, we have some invisible code, and one thing we could do is we could actually see, the easiest thing to do is just look at your services. I'm not going to go too hard on this right now, but off on the left, if you're on the Silverlight project, and in particular if we get to one of the windows, right now is I'm going to go just, let's say, into my About window. I did everything in the About box. We're going to see a split view where we're seeing the XAML page, and we've got ourselves a data grid. This is a data bound control for Silverlight, and it's, you know, a standard data grid that allows you to see the columns, you know, in a normal form. And then I have a data entry, a data form. That's a data bound form that can be used to edit elements. Interesting part here is that when I generated this, I went to my, get to the right piece, okay, this piece also got pulled off. Bummer. There's a data source that normally pops up. off as a tab on the left, and I had that highlighted and set up. You select a data source. This is different from a database data source. This is saying here are the services you have available, and all you have to do is click on it, and you can just go drop in a data grid or data form immediately, or a list immediately that's all data bound and ready to go. And that's how this was generated originally. This code on this side started out as just a drop down. So my data grid was a drop down, and it by reflection found out that I have an ID, I have a name, I have a year published. Well, if we go back to my service, and my conceptual model has an ID, a name, and a year published. And this can all be customized. Okay, if there's associations, you can put in the associations. In other words, you don't have to have just simple tables, but this is the easiest way to get started. So you're really reflecting this through, and in the code, this is done with data binding, so this looks more complicated, but it turns out you just get a domain data service, you just go do an inquiry, and you can either grab all the records out of, let's say, a table, or whatever type of query you want to do in a standard way. These are all available. You make the queries on the server side, and then you're going to see the same client then on those exposed services. And then based on attributes, you do your validation if you want to. If you do validation, though, validation is put on attributes on the server side. That seems counterintuitive. So like right now, is I have an example password field, and I've got a regex that's an attribute that's put on just to look and see if we have appropriate passwords. This is on a different project. That's actually done on the server side, and you go into a metadata class, standard entity things, and we're going to see more about that next month. So I don't want to really go that deep, but it turns out that metadata set of attributes, all the types of validation things you traditionally want for the database, can easily be done then on the server side, and that's the traditional first place to do it, unless you're wanting to do very quick user scanning that's going to have to be interactive and very fast. So you're doing server-side validation, and you can do this with attributes or with custom validation methods if you want to put them in. Okay, so on this side then, just looking very quickly at the About box, code behind's nothing. All we're doing right here is I'm grabbing a little event. Okay, I've got a data form. The data form was that piece on the right-hand side where I want to edit and modify records. So if we're going to do this, what's going to happen is we're getting a local copy, right? We're playing disconnected, and whenever we have an edit ended, we're going to have an editable kind of process here. So the thing is, we're doing a full transaction. Either you do it or revert it, but until you submit it, it's not going to happen. The edit ended is a good event that you can catch for edit changes so you can update your database. And so what's going to happen is on the edit ended, all I'm doing is going to my book domain data source. This was done by reflection. It just set this up for me. Since I had a book object and a book service, it has a book domain data source that was automatically named for my book data. And then I just go do submit changes. This then takes my local copy, whatever I'm editing, and then updates the database with it. Wow, that's pretty tough. Okay, and again, you can use standard queries in standard ways, but realize that whatever you're doing here, use your API then to put it back in on your persistent store. One of the tricks you can do is you can do some things in navigation. One of the things that happened is also have a loaded data event and looking for load errors in case there's a problem. So if you can't connect to your database or there's something really screwed up, like you don't have a data connection at all, there's some way to at least send an error off into the user so they can see the results. There isn't much code here in the code behind. Most of the rest of this is binding. So just about done. On this side then, we have XAML for 2 controls, and this was mostly dropped in. I didn't generate that much code, just formatted it to look a little nicer. The first thing we care about is we have a domain data source. Domain data source is my connection. This is saying, here's my RIA service that I have, and it's a data source that's available that I can bind to. When I have loaded data, I have a loaded data background method. So you saw that method in the code behind. Okay. And I'm calling this my book domain data source. Remember, XAML builds things. If we go back to the code behind, we call this thing a book domain data source for submit changes. So that was our name thing. We created our connection to our service so we can now send things back and forth, and we call it by that name we just gave it. Also, going back to this, once we have this data source, we're now giving it a domain context, and I'm calling it my book context. Okay, that's just the default that the wizards give me, so you could rename this to whatever you want to. The my colon is a namespace, and you define it in the top of your code, so you can go look at this if you care about it. And then we just give it a name of book context. Now, my data grid starts here. If you see this highlighted area. Okay, this is the core set of pieces, and you'll notice that the main thing that we're caring about here is the item source, our source of our data. We're sitting there, and then the rest of this line is basically just saying, well, I'm going to the data here in my book domain data source. We made a data source. This was done when I did a drop of the control, all for me. And we're now attaching it as an item source for my data grid. Done. The rest of this, if we care about it, is I wanted this to be styled and I explicitly wanted an order. I can sit there and change some names and things. So instead of using the default, which is just my entity property names, I can change the name to whatever I want to display in the grid. Right? But if I name things correctly and the database maps pretty well to what I want to display to the user, we got a one-to-one correspondence. I'm done. Now, a little more complicated is you can also set up a data form. And you will notice here, data form has the same idea. It has an item source for an element name, and it's looking at the active element from my data grid. So its book domain data source is still my element name. This is my editable piece. The line above here is where I can customize what operations I want. So there's a list of different operations. Most of them are supported here. I can add, delete, edit, commit, and cancel items. And realize all this is local unless you submit changes. So somewhere you have to have an event in the code behind or someplace where you're finally going to submit this back to your database. Okay, that's it. You notice that most of this was pre-generated. I customized a couple things just so it looked a little prettier. It's easy to style this. Like you can have an edit style, an insert style. You can change how things look completely. We have some styles recently that Keith did that looks massively different than the default data control. But when we start playing with it then, this is one attached to a SQL database. This is just SQL Express or SQL Standard, don't remember which. And we start without debugging. Okay, really fast. And remember, I'm using IIS Express. And so what it's using is just a port number. All of this is using my user account. Doesn't need administrative access for this. And it's deliberately designed to be very fast for development. What I did was to get things up and running. If you die on construction in Silverlight, you won't see anything. So a good way to test is go into a home page that has nothing. So you can at least see Silverlight. And then I put things in the about. And this is just sheer for the heck of it. But it turns out from a functional standpoint of getting going, always have a home landing page that's pretty safe and generic to get things up and running. Or your debugging can be a problem when on construction it dies. Like the XAML reflection doesn't build a XAML object on construction. It'll give you an error when you're in debug mode, but it doesn't give you great errors. Okay, so when we go into about, this might take just a tiny bit of time to update, and I could put a busy indicator. There is one in Silverlight now in 3 and 4, I think. Haven't done that? Okay, it took a while. And notice that things aren't terribly exciting here, but I have a data store that's persistent. I can add new items, and I really shouldn't have the ID field. So I can do a data template for my data entry form, and I could pull off the ID, and right now it's being auto-generated. I really, really don't want to change this one, but I can just have a book name. Anybody have a book name you care about? Keith, you read so many. Pardon? Okay. Is that a book? I know it's a movie or series. Okay, and then year published. Now, I don't have much in the way of validation. I could actually have a range for numbers for things that are legitimate. Let's say that's 2006 or something. Sound okay? Wow. Now, the way things go, you set up your data context every time you hit a page by default. You tend not to persist pages. So if I go to the home page and I go back to the about page, that's there. That's actually in my persistent data store. We could go look at it. We now have a service. So really what we've done is we go through a few steps. We have to go through extra compilation steps. We really have the entity framework 4 being reflected across as a proxy so we can access things in Silverlight. And then we have data-bound controls to do all sorts of nifty things. It turns out there's a lot of complicated code happening, but it's actually fairly simple. Not quite as easy as ASP.NET, but in some cases it does have some of the same richness, and they're trying to make it so it is at least comparable to be able to build things very fast and get up and running very quickly. Okay, that's it for today, and I ended up talking a little bit more than half an hour, but I beat my time limit. So, thank you.